This is Empire Supernova, Chapter 4, The Siege of the Venezuelan Embassy.
Right there you can see Francisco Marquez. He can't go back to Venezuela because he helped organize the violent guarimbas, which took place in the country several years ago. During that time, he was also arrested, or found rather, with I think $3 million in his car. No explanation of how he got all that cash. Francisco Marquez, what were you doing at the CSIS meeting planning the invasion of Venezuela? What were you doing? Yeah. You can see that most of the press here is on the side of the pro-coup activists. This man, Marquez, he's singing his country's national anthem even though he was recently at a meeting at a think tank here in Washington, D.C., the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was at a meeting called Assessing Military Options in Venezuela. He's posing as an ambassador, however, he actually met in the foreign capital, in the capital of a foreign country, to discuss the military invasion of his own country. It's very, very bizarre behavior.
Muy buenas tardes a mis hermanos venezolanos. ¡Viva Venezuela libre! ¡Viva Venezuela libre! Se acabó la usurpación en este edificio. Hoy tenemos una tierra acá, un pedacito de Venezuela en libertad. I would say a few words in English. 2 weeks ago, I walked here in this same place. And I said that time that the trespassers had their days counted. 2 weeks later, the trespassers are out of our embassy. We recovered our embassy. This is a free territory. This is a symbol of freedom. This will be the embassy of freedom in coordination with the U.S. government. This is what we are. This is what we are. This is what we represent, the new Venezuela. We have conquered this building. The next building will be the Miraflores Palace. We also want to thank to the U.S. government, to the U.S. administration, to the Trump administration for the support. Also to the State Department and the all security forces that have helped us. We need to keep our focus. We need to keep our main objective to set a transitional government in Venezuela and call for a free and fair election. This is our agenda. We are pretty close. It's a matter of time. We will keep our determination on the streets. We will keep our spirit of hope. We will increase our pressure in Venezuela, and we will increase the pressure from the international community.
On May 16th, 2019, DC police stormed the Venezuelan embassy, arresting the last remaining members of the Embassy Protection Collective. The collective was charged by the Venezuelan government with ensuring the embassy's safety after diplomatic relations between Venezuela and the United States broke down. Over the course of about a month, Guaido's most militant, right-wing supporters in DC besieged the embassy on behalf of the appointed so-called ambassador, Carlos Vecchio. Among the ranks were employees of the World Bank, the NATO-backed regime change think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, and weapons manufacturer Raytheon. The Guaido supporters shouted homophobic and racist insults at the Embassy Protection Collective, while threatening to kill and rape journalists and collective members. They stole food from peace activists, engaged in violence against those trying to deliver the food, flashed strobe lights into the embassy, and blasted air horns inches from the ears of the collective. They attempted to break into the building on several occasions. During the siege, the police, Trump's Secret Service, and later the U.S. Marshals intervened to give Guaido supporters the strategic advantage. When a month of siege warfare failed to break the collective's resolve, the police illegally entered the building, violating key articles of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The excerpts you just heard were from the heavily protested press release by Guaido's appointees one day after the seizure of the embassy, as recorded by Anya Parampil of the Grayzone. They wasted no time in heartily thanking Donald Trump, the State Department, and U.S. forces of regime change for their so-called victory. Because the Guaido puppet regime does not control any territory or government position in Venezuela, the embassy building under the control of Vecchio will not be able to fulfill any of the diplomatic functions that an embassy is tasked to carry out. This is a hollow victory for Guaido and Trump. The fallout from this violation of international law has consequences far beyond the U.S. war on Venezuela. It puts U.S. embassies across the world at risk of similar seizure if diplomatic relations were to break down. On this two-part episode of Empire Supernova, we speak with organizers who were on the ground during the siege of the embassy. First, we hear from Claire Cook, an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Later, we speak with Kevin Zeese, a political activist and the co-director of Popular Resistance. Kevin was part of the collective that legally maintained the embassy from the beginning of the siege until the police raid on May 16th. We talked to Claire only 2 days before the seizure of the embassy, so the interview reflects the urgency of the situation. The process of resistance to this U.S. seizure exposed the farce that is the U.S. propping up of Guaido's claim to the presidency of Venezuela.
Que tú te levantes, América Latina obrera, no sé por qué no lo haces. El yanqui teme a la revolución, el yanqui teme grito, yanqui go home, yanqui go home. Y viene remontando el Amazonas, el grito rebelde del carioca, y viene a unirse con su hermano, el obrero venezolano. América Latina obrera, América Latina obrera, América Latina. Levanten tus manos la bandera de la revolución, América Latina obrera, y griten con fuerza, Yankee go home, Yankee go home, Yankee go home. Gringo, go home. Los obreros de América Latina te dicen, gringo, go home. Yankee, go home. Levanten tus manos la bandera de la revolución, América Latina obrera, y grita con fuerza, Yankee go home, Yankee go home, Yankee go home.
As of last night, Monday, May 13th, U.S. Marshals, together with D.C. Metropolitan Police and the Secret Service, attempted to breach the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., and illegally evict the current tenants of that embassy, a group known as the Embassy Protection Collective, that has been maintaining the sovereignty of that embassy in place of the Venezuelan diplomats who were forced to leave when diplomatic relations broke down. As part of a deeper context, though, the sovereignty of this embassy, even without the diplomats in place, the legal tenancy still belongs to the Embassy Protection Collective as signed off on by the Venezuelan government. And the sovereignty of the embassy itself still remains with the country of Venezuela. So if this were to come to pass, that in the past couple weeks, this essentially blockade and siege of the embassy, which has resulted in the cutting off of power as well as water and attacks on various embassy protectors, as well as death threats and rape threats by the right-wing Guaido supporting opposition. If this were come to pass, that these embassy protectors, the legal tenants, were to be evicted, and that this right-wing mob, under largely the direction or under the kind of banner of Guaido's so-called appointed ambassador, Carlos Vecchio, if they were to occupy the embassy, this would be a large breach of international law and would set a new and disturbing precedent for the takeover of embassies across the world, including U.S. embassies, when diplomatic relations broke down. So to talk about the real implications of all this and what it has looked like on the scene there for the past couple weeks, we are joined by Claire Cook with the Answer Coalition. Thank you very much, Claire, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you maybe start at the beginning? What led up to the moment of the transfer of sovereignty over to the Embassy Protection Collective by the Venezuelan government? Why, essentially, how did this embassy become the point of a struggle for sovereignty that it did?
Absolutely. And I'll go back to January. I could go back to the years of sanctions by the U.S. and back to 2002 with the coup attempts and back to the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, but I'll just go back to January of this year. So January 23rd is when the U.S. recognized the self-declared new president or interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. They recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. This came after Juan Guaido declared himself because as he's the president of the National Assembly. And so basically it's a soft coup attempt supported by the U.S. to change the government in Venezuela. Currently, the president is Nicolas Maduro. So this recognition of Juan Guaido, basically a U.S. puppet, this led to a breakdown of relations between the U.S. and Venezuela. U.S. diplomats and Venezuelan diplomats, the embassies were had to be closed down and people have had to leave. Their visas have been revoked. So for the last few months since January, diplomats in D.C., Washington, D.C., have been slowly leaving the embassy and leaving the country. So as they were leaving, anticipating that the U.S. would facilitate the takeover of the embassies, the consulates, and other diplomatic compounds, some diplomats in Washington, D.C. reached out to organizations, anti-war organizations, peace organizations that have been calling for demonstrations and marches and rallies against the U.S. aggressions against Venezuela, reach out to these organizations to see if there would be people who would be willing to start residing at the embassy as a way of protecting the building in the short term. So typically what would happen is, an embassy would close down and it would just remain closed. But in this case, with the U.S. supporting the coup government of Guaido, this puppet government, we wanted to, take some action to protect the building. So starting April 10th, I believe, is the first night that members of Code Pink, which is a women-led peace organization, actually stayed the night there. And then for the first few weeks, people were staying there every evening, staying there all day, and every day we would hold political education events, community forums, film screenings, those kinds of things to invite people in to learn more about the situation in Venezuela. And then in the last few weeks, the situation has escalated.
And I think it's also important to understand the mechanism by which Juan Guaido so-called declared himself the president. He used an obscure mechanism within the Venezuelan constitution to declare himself the interim president, rather. According to this particular mechanism, this only applies, first of all, if the sitting president is incapacitated. So when Juan Guaido essentially made this claim, he was making no claim as to according to the constitutional mechanism, there is no claim within the constitutional mechanism that that would allow for essentially the calling of new elections based on the quote unquote illegitimacy of this election. So he was not using using the Venezuelan constitution. He was not using that to challenge the legitimacy of elections. The actual challenge he was making was the capacity of the president. So if this were enacted, if there was any legitimacy at all to this use of the constitution, the next person in line who would have been essentially brought in to the presidency under this would have been Delcy Rodriguez, who's the vice president and who, like Nicolas Maduro, is alive and cognizant and competent. There's nothing to suggest that either one of these is in a coma right now. So that even if Maduro were in a coma or otherwise incapacitated, Delcy Rodriguez, his vice president, would have been the person to take over, not the elected leader or the unelected leader rather of the National Assembly, which is no longer and has not been for quite some time a functioning body of government within the Venezuelan government. They don't do anything. They have no essentially legal authority whatsoever. Even if we ignore all of that, and we suggest that somehow Juan Guaido was able to skip over the entire line of succession to the presidency of the Venezuelan government and declare himself to be president, he would have had 30 days as of late January to hold new elections. He has not held any elections whatsoever. So this would have been a moot point essentially by March. At absolute latest. So having failed to hold new elections, having failed to sit anyone in government anywhere, having failed essentially to take over anything in the country, Juan Guaido now holds no power anywhere whatsoever. And yet he continues to kind of appoint these kind of fake ambassadors, including Carlos Vecchio, to, supposedly take over these kind of various points. So Carlos Vecchio has been one of the people spearheading the effort to lead essentially what can only be described as a right-wing mob. That is people shouting homophobic and ethnic slurs, threatening to rape and kill the embassy protectors. Carlos Vecchio has essentially been spearheading the efforts of that mob, along with so many other kind of unsavory figures to essentially declare that somehow they have sovereignty over this again, when in reality, as we talked about, the legal tenancy of this building remains in the hands of the Venezuelan government and their appointees. According to the Vienna Conventions of 1961, normalizing diplomatic relations, the U.S. has every obligation to ensure that this property is free of damage and that it is at no point occupied by people who are not allowed in there by the Venezuelan government. And yet the actions on the ground have told a different story as to what the U.S., specifically the D.C. Metropolitan Police, the Secret Service, and the much later the U.S. Marshals have been attempting to do. Can you talk about how essentially this began to escalate with regard to the two kind of groups, that is the pro-Guaido, primarily white, primarily rich opposition, and the various people outside the embassy who are not part of the Embassy Protection Collective per se, but who were essentially trying to protect the building from damage at the hands of the opposition?
Absolutely. And actually, I would even say that we, as the Embassy Protection Collective, we kind of call them inside protectors and outside protectors. So at one point, many of the people outside have stayed inside. After the siege began, some people could no longer get inside. So we kind of refer to anyone who supports this movement in any way as a member of our the Embassy Protection Collective. But what happened was, so for May 1st, Juan Guaido had been calling for, mass popular uprising in Venezuela, and it seemed that there was plans being made for a coup attempt to happen on May 1st, and turned out that they sort of shot it a day early, so ended up on April 30th taking some actions in terms of trying to flip some high-ranking military officials and failing to do so, trying to get other military personnel to flip, trying to do a big march and a big mobilization. There's a few things that they were doing, some coup attempts in Venezuela. So that kind of coincided with what we saw happening on the ground in DC. So up for the first few weeks from April 10th until April 30th, it was relatively peaceful outside the embassy. You would see a few opposition folks show up, yell at people, cuss people out, follow people around, but no real security issues. We would have people watching the doors to make sure that there weren't attempted break-ins, but it was relatively low risk compared to what happened. So basically on April 30th is when a large number of opposition folks descended on the embassy and began protesting and have laid siege to the building. So there's like several entry points by which you can enter and exit the property. They would block exits. They were blowing air horns and sirens. They got flashlights and would shine flashlights and strobe lights in your eyes and follow people around, and anywhere you would try to go, if you tried to approach the door to get inside or to talk to someone who was inside, they would basically mob and surround you. And so from those first few days following April 30th, it was just an intense escalation of violence and attack by the opposition against the embassy protectors. So, as you mentioned, they really exposed the character of the opposition through their actions. Many of the people, in addition to threats of violence or the violence of having, air horns directly blown, like I had air horns blown inches from my ear, like blown so hard that I could feel the chemicals from the air horn dripping on my shirt. And, your head just kind of goes dizzy for a bit, and then you kind of learn how to block it out a little bit. This was before we thought to get the earplugs. This was still early on. You would get pushed around if we sort of came to a stalemate where we're both trying to stand close to the building. They would be kicking you with their legs where they believed that the Secret Service or the law enforcement couldn't see them doing so, pitching people, trying to crush people with their arms, that kind of thing. So that the physical assault was pretty standard, and then there would be a lot of verbal attacks, like you said, misogynistic comments, homophobia, transphobia, racial slurs. There's a lot of video documentation of this. Threats of violence, threats of rape, coming from all kinds of different people toward the Embassy Protection Collective. And our tactic with all of this was, as much as possible, to not engage, to just ignore them, just record what they were doing and document this kind of violent behavior, because we were not there to protest the opposition. We were there to protect the embassy. So even though we were no longer able to get inside, our goal was just to make sure that the people inside remain safe. There was a few evenings where I was at home and was called urgently come down. one evening came down urgently. They were basically banging on the doors so hard and messing with the doors to try to break in, and it really seemed from the inside that a break-in was imminent. And because of their violent nature, we were very concerned about the safety of the people inside if they were to break in. And so I came down, saw that there was very few supporters on our side there, and they were all kind of barricaded and blockaded off for safety. And so all I could do was just take my phone out and start recording and live streaming, even though you could barely see anything because they would shine the strobe lights and put their hands in the way. They would just have, there's probably 100 people just following me around, screaming, shouting, blowing sirens in my ear.
Yeah, the strobe lights, and another part of that is also, again, as you mentioned, the different what I think we could kind of ironically call sonic attacks. So for those people who remember that the Trump administration, essentially what seems to have trumped up a while back, so-called sonic attacks that were happening against the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. That was a point they were trying to make. Yet to this day, they've yet to establish that there were any sonic attacks. I think the study that was released officially on what those so-called sonic attacks on the American embassy in Cuba were most likely, I think, crickets or something to that effect. But yeah, the attacks on the embassy based on the pro-Guaido supporters here have been similar sorts of violence that we've seen actually within the country of Venezuela. So by the Guaido supporters there, I think one of the important things is when they were flashing the strobe lights, they were doing so with the full intention, as best anyone can tell, with the full intention of also attacking people who might be epileptic. So that becomes, when you're being hit with strobe lights the entire time, anyone with epilepsy or anyone who might have other kind of issues with sensory issues like that are put in actual, very real physical danger of that could affect their livelihood and well-being. The same with, again, the sonic attacks here. It wasn't just the Guaido supporters who were bringing in these air horns, but later on, the police were also bringing in what is called an LRAD. That's a long-range acoustic device. These have been banned in other major cities, such as I believe New York City just banned these recently because of the very real damage. Essentially, these can blow out people's eardrums if used certain way or against certain sensitive people. So this would constitute absolutely a sonic assault in many ways upon the embassy. Can you maybe talk about how the police essentially aided in the assault here, in the essentially the siege on the embassy? I'm thinking first, first by that kind of separation that they did of the two crowds, where essentially they put all of the pro-embassy people on the opposite side of the street, and then allow the pro-Guaido supporters to surround the embassy and begin to assault anyone who approached their barricade. But then it got kind of even worse onward. So maybe you can take us through the police kind of assistance here and the Secret Service assistance to these forces.
Absolutely, yeah. So from the beginning, we've seen the U.S. Secret Service basically abandon its responsibility to the embassy of Venezuela in favor of the pro-coup opposition Guaido supporting people. So again, at the beginning, relatively calm. The Secret Service would patrol regularly. They were actually one of our biggest security concerns from the beginning, in terms of anticipating if they might try to arrest people or enter the building. But for the most part, those first few weeks, they just questioned people and watched and observed. But once the opposition folks started showing up, they basically turned a blind eye to what was happening. The Article 22 of the Vienna Convention, which is a framework for diplomatic relations that we've been referencing throughout all this, is what kind of says that a host country is supposed to protect the embassy of the other countries. It holds that the embassies are inviolable. That means that they should not be trespassed or broken into, and they certainly shouldn't be invaded by the host country. So that would include people who are not diplomatic officials, be they Venezuelans or not, who don't have permission to enter the property. So if we just think of any other embassy, whether it's, let's think it's Israel or China or Russia or, the UK, whatever embassy you choose, just try to imagine what would happen if a group of people, whether they're US people or people, expats from the UK, what would happen if they attempted to smash windows, break security cameras, and pound on the doors of that embassy? The Secret Service would immediately intervene and stop that from happening. But yet when it happened here at the Venezuelan embassy with the pro-coup supporters smashing windows, trying to break in, breaking security cameras, breaking lights, posting stuff all over the building, covering windows, blocking people from entering the building who have a legal right to be there, making death threats against diplomats that were still on site. These are all the kinds of actions that we've seen from the opposition that the Secret Service simply ignored, and in some cases aided and abetted. So when it comes to us trying to get food and medicine and needed supplies into the embassy, this is when we've really seen a breakdown in the protection of the embassy. If you call the Secret Service, we did encourage people to call the number and ask them whether or not they were blocking food. They every time would read this recorded message about, oh, we're not blocking food, we're upholding the law, blah, blah, blah. But over and over and over again, anytime we attempted to get food in, they would let the opposition attack us, steal the food, grab the ropes that we're using to pulley things up, that kind of thing. And then as time has gone on, we have seen the U.S. Secret Service draw back from the sort of skirmishes and immediate things that are going on the ground with the protectors and the opposition, and they've basically had Metropolitan Police Department, local DC police step in and, in the words of the MPD, kind of keep the peace and keep the safety, ensure public safety. So now you see the MPD be the ones to separate opposition folks and sort of facilitate the opposition preventing food from entering. Just yesterday, we attempted to do a food into one of the high-story windows and through a rope pulley system, and the opposition attacked the people who were trying to get the food up. They stole the bags or ripped them away, and we're doing some skirmish to try to get the bags back. The police, a dozen of them just standing and watching till finally one of the leading officers, I suppose, said, okay, let's get in there and break it up. Then they break up the skirmish. The police are holding the bag of food that's just tied to a rope. They have it in their hands. Rather than simply letting go of the bag, which would allow the protectors inside to pull it up, they cut the string to the bag. So in that case, the police themselves actually blocked food from entering the building. And again, there's no illegal, getting food into a building is not illegal. Delivering food to a building, to legal residents inside an embassy, is not illegal. Again, I encourage people to think what would happen if any other embassy people were blocking people from entering who are delivering food. That just wouldn't happen. So we've really seen the police trample all over the rights of people inside and outside the embassy. And then last night we saw potentially the most egregious example where the Secret Service appeared to be ready to cross the threshold and arrest people from inside the embassy, which would be the major violation of the Vienna Convention, but it didn't turn out that they did that.
The first thing I'd like to do is actually read a little bit of the Vienna Convention so people have an understanding. This is not an international law that can be interpreted in many different ways. The international law on this is very, very clear. Article 1 of the Vienna Convention states that for the purpose of the present convention, the following expressions have the meanings hereunder assigned to them. The head of the mission is the person charged by the sending state with the duty of acting in that capacity. The members of the mission are the head of the mission and the members of the staff of the mission. The members of the staff of the mission are the members of the diplomatic staff, of the administrative and technical staff, and of the service staff of the mission, so on and so forth. That is to say, there is no, when we're talking about who is the diplomatic mission to the embassy, there is no requirement that that mission be the Venezuelan diplomats themselves. But can be essentially, it doesn't have to be a person of Venezuelan nationality. It only has to be someone who is assigned to that by the Venezuelan government, which is recognized by the United Nations as being under the PSUV and Nicolas Maduro. Juan Guaido's own claim to the presidency has long since expired. Even if you gave it any legitimacy at the beginning, his claim to the presidency expired 30 days after he claimed himself president when he failed to hold new elections. Again, that should have, even if he invoked that clause of the Constitution, that should have put Delcy Rodriguez as the new vice president. But even so, there we go. So now I'm going to skip to Article 22. The premises of the mission shall be inviolable. The agents of the receiving state may not enter them except with the consent of the head of the mission. The receiving state is under a special duty to take all appropriate steps to protect the premises of the mission against any intrusion or damage, and to prevent any disturbance of the peace of the mission or impairment of its dignity. The premises of the mission, their furnishings and other property thereon, and the means of transport of the mission shall be immune from search, requisition, attachment, or execution. So that's being said, the most, obviously the actual violations, the first kind of violations of this occurred when the police both prevented food from getting inside the building by, again, cutting the ropes, as you mentioned, to the food that the Embassy Protection Collective was trying to send up, but then also by illegally blocking the sidewalk outside the embassy and allowing Guaido supporters to have exclusive control, as documented by Medea Benjamin and her lawyer, who is also there. I'm forgetting the name of the lawyer who was there, but essentially they recorded video evidence showing that the police were specifically denying people access to the area where the right-wing Guaido supporters were holed up next to the embassy, and essentially only allowing tourists to pass through there, but not anyone who was going there with a political purpose to the embassy. So by preventing food from getting there, by shutting the electricity off, I believe it was at the request of, again, the fake ambassador Carlos Vecchio, who was appointed by the fake president Juan Guaido, by essentially taking that at face value and shutting the power off, even though the bill was fully paid. And then I believe later the water was shut off, either because the water was electrically pumped, or that the water company there also has participated in this. By doing all of these things, they have clearly violated Article 22 in a way that I don't believe is very ambiguous. It's not. It is a clear, undeniable violation of Article 22 of the Vienna Convention. So that brings us to what happened essentially last night, which is that the police attempted to evict. They were about to enter the premises of the embassy in yet another violation of Article 22, an attempt to evict on behalf of, essentially, I believe it was on fake stationery, was the amazing thing. Like, this is such an obvious farce, but they were trying to evict the Embassy Protection Collective. Can you talk about essentially what transpired last night? And again, to remind our listeners, we're recording this on May 14th. So this would have been May 13th.
Right. So last night, I believe it was between 6 and 7 p.m. around that time. Yeah, we got the call to come down to the embassy as soon as possible. It really, because the people inside could see that there were all the tents and the sort of encampment that the Guaido supporters had set up in the courtyard outside the embassy in the back. were being cleared out very rapidly. Everyone was being moved out of the courtyard into the front, including the opposition folks, and that these notices were being posted on the door, and we couldn't yet read them, but we suspected that they're being posted by law enforcement. I believe the federal agents from the State Department were posting them. So, we come down there, we need to know very quickly what's happening. It really seemed that illegal seizure was imminent and that arrests were imminent. And so came down a chaotic scene. That's when the police, the Metropolitan Police, were using the LRAD device. They would blast out this really loud siren noise, and then one of them would read this trespassing notice, just like the fake President Guaido, just like the fake puppet ambassadors, Vecchio. Now you have this fake trespassing notice, which just to me, even now, seems like a joke because, it's just something that someone wrote up in a Word document. There's no letterhead, there's no signature, there's no seal, there's no contact information. It doesn't even say who is issuing this order. It just says Embassy and OAS mission trespassing notice, and then the text of the notice, which is saying that the U.S. government doesn't recognize the, quote, former Maduro regime, which is, again, laughable because last I checked, Maduro is still very much in power in Venezuela, and that they recognize ambassadors Vecchio and Tare. They don't even refer to them by their full names. They just say Vecchio and Tare. And that they have requested that everyone is present believe, and that the people there are trespassing according to these ambassadors that the U.S. recognizes as part of the legitimate government of Venezuela. So using this, what we're seeing now in terms of what didn't happen last night, what ended up didn't happen, was that it was a very big intimidation tactic. So several Embassy Protection Collective members who were inside did end up leaving because they did not want to risk arrest. So they ended up leaving, but 4 people remained inside, knowing that they were risking arrest. And so the DC Fire Department arrived. They cut the bolts of the front doors. There were some chains on the front doors keeping it locked up. Then the U.S. Secret Service opened the doors of the building and stepped into what's basically like an entryway. And so I guess one can consider that's not officially entering the embassy. So they stood in the entryway, and the 4 collective members came down and stood in the inside of the embassy where they could be seen and heard by the U.S. Secret Service officers, but they could not be, they couldn't be grabbed. And so what happened is, according to Mara from the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, she's a constitutional lawyer who has been doing a lot of the legal, on-the-ground legal negotiating and talking with law enforcement to kind of understand what's happening and also advise law enforcement of the many ways they're violating not only our human rights and our basic civil rights here in Washington, D.C., but the international rights and laws that they're violating. So she was able to get a really close view of what was happening. And she said the Secret Service said, "You're trespassing, you need to leave." And the Embassy Protection Collective members, with the full knowledge they have of the Vienna Convention, said, "We will not be leaving unless we know that we are following international law, and that by us leaving, it wouldn't be breaking international law, and that you wouldn't then facilitate these supporters coming in. We will not leave. We won't just leave on our own. We want to be assured that this is following the law and that the building won't be illegally seized." They just continue to repeat that, and it really seems that the U.S. Secret Service were expecting and hoping that they would simply cross over the threshold, and then the U.S. Secret Service could grab them and arrest them. And since they were unwilling to step forward and do that, the Secret Service huddled up, talked amongst themselves, and it seems that they were not in agreement that this little fake trespassing notice was enough to justify entering the building officially and violating the Vienna Convention. So it seems that there was some sort of breakdown in terms of whose authority was given. One of the things that the collective members also said was, the police are asking to be invited in. Also, they're saying, oh, well, can we come in to arrest you? And they said, well, no, we're not the owners of this building. We're not, this building actually isn't ours to decide whether the police can enter. So we have to say, no, you would have to talk to the owners about that. We're just here as guests. And so you would think that if the true owners, according to the U.S. government, is Guaido and Vecchio and these puppet people, they could have simply said, oh, well, we have their permission to enter. So it seems that that's what's probably happening behind the scenes now, is they're trying to figure out, whose authority they need to be able to cross that threshold. It seems for now, every moment, we don't know what will happen day to day, moment to moment, but it seems for now that the U.S. Secret Service is not yet willing to break that big one of violating the embassy, entering, illegally arresting people, and seizing the property. They want the Embassy Protection Collective members to leave of their own will. That's why they've helped facilitate the starvation. They're hoping that they will just leave and then they can simply step back and do nothing while the opposition takes it over, as they were able to do with some other diplomatic compounds in DC and with the consulate in New York.
There are also so many obvious parallels here between what has been attempted against the embassy in DC, as well as the actual country of Venezuela, in that the stepping up of sanctions is clearly designed to wear down the resolve of the Venezuelan people and make them more willing to accept a puppet government for the end of starvation. So according to the figures released by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the sanctions in Venezuela so far, and again, these have been going on for years, the sanctions have caused 40,000 deaths. There are something like 16,000 people with cancer, 16,000 people who need dialysis, 80,000 with HIV, and 4 million people in the country with diabetes and hypertension who cannot access the treatment they need. And the reason they cannot access the treatment is because of the sanctions that have been placed on Venezuela that are preventing the importation of these badly needed medicines. And so you see this kind of thing. You see this with Juan Guaido. He's on the one hand talking about how much the Venezuelan people are suffering, and then what is he calling for people to do about it? Rather than at this point even calling for people in the country to rise up, he is now simply calling for the U.S. to impose more sanctions and for the U.S. military to be directly involved. So what kind of person wants the United States, who's created such destruction across the world, who's destroyed the countries of Iraq, of Libya, who's attempted to destroy Syria, who's led a Nazi coup in Ukraine, the U.S. kills everything they touch with so-called humanitarian aid and military intervention. What kind of person would want that for their own country? What kind of person would accept that in? I know that's entirely a rhetorical question, but it very much goes to show what the Juan Guaido, as the kind of puppet who, again, every time he pulls one of these actions, he himself flees to the embassies of various countries. I believe he's been in the Chilean embassy. I think Leopoldo Lopez has been in the Spanish embassy. The sort of irony of this, that they are able to flee to these embassies that they know to be inviolable, while they themselves ask for the violation of the U.S. embassy, I think is very, very telling.
They should think about that a little bit, and the U.S. should consider what if they do cross this threshold and historically break with the Vienna Convention, which has been the norm for diplomatic relations, and it's just like a very basic way of having like the most simple of relationships between countries. What would it mean for them? What would it mean for the people, for them to go into an embassy and know that, well, actually, maybe it could be violated just like we violated the U.S., the embassy, the Venezuelan embassy in the U.S. And any U.S. embassy could be violated in the same way. And it really has repercussions, I think, in terms of who recognizes which governments as legitimate or, not legitimate. And it raises a lot of very interesting international questions that I don't know that, the average Secret Service person is really thinking or prepared to deal with, like what could be the consequences of taking these actions. So I think we really are trying to encourage down to the fire department, a person who's bringing their bolt cutters. We're encouraging all of them, make sure you understand what it is you're doing. You can't just follow orders. These are, we have as many signs and visuals as possible to let them know we know what the law is, and you really shouldn't violate these laws. But going back quickly to the parallels between this very small case of the Embassy Protection Collective being under siege and the sanctions against Venezuela, it's funny. It's perhaps ironic because the opposition says the same thing that we say. They say, "Oh, haha! Now you get to see what it's like to be in Venezuela." They don't make the connection that the sanctions are a major source of the problems with food shortages, and that the sabotage by corporations in Venezuela that are against the Maduro government are a source of food and medicine shortages. They don't really make that connection. They simply say, good, you can starve the way people in Venezuela starve. And they really seem to take a pleasure in knowing that people don't have water, don't have running water, don't have power, don't have food. They are happy and cheering when they see these kinds of things being denied people. So it really makes you think, what kind of people are they? Do they really care about the people of Venezuela who are suffering if they take pleasure in seeing that someone, 50 feet away from them doesn't have food? And they say, well, they can, if they want food, they can leave the embassy and get it. And so they really are, it's a very intentional strategy and tactic that they're using. If they hope that if people get hungry enough, they will leave the embassy and then they'll get their way. So you can really see that it's very clear that there's the tactic is the same. And obviously it's on a very much smaller scale. And, the folks inside the embassy, they've been doing this for a few weeks. They're very humble in terms of just being glad that there's this opportunity for U.S. people to, put their bodies on the line and say, we're going to do whatever it takes to stop this from happening. And so it's just a very interesting parallel to see how the opposition treats the people who can't get food, and how the U.S. state, whether it's the Secret Service and the Metropolitan Police or whether it's the military, they treat the people the same way.
Yeah, and the Guaido supporters have gloated about it. It's clear that's not the actions you get from people who have really experienced the real poverty, real starvation and oppression. You don't get those people then turning around being like, ha, now you get to experience it too.
Right.
And I think I want to point out that someone actually revealed the identities of 3 of the people who have been involved in the pro-Guaido violence, or who have been involved in the pro-Guaido mob that is engaged in this violence outside the embassy. So I want to read. I know that some people are going to love me for this, but I want to read some tweets. We're in that age where I can read some tweets. This comes from the person who essentially exposed these 3. Class character of the pro-Guaido opposition. This is Alejandro Perez Barrios, former employee of the World Bank and currently a senior manager at IFC, a member of the World Bank Group, a direct contributor to neoliberalism and poverty in the Third World. And it shows a picture of a man at the outside blocking the embassy, and it shows his picture on social media. The next one, Moises Rendon works for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a hawkish think tank backed by NATO, defense contractors, and Gulf monarchies. Note that the moles on his face and neck match, and again, it shows a picture of pro-Guaido Venezuelan who works for the CSIS, and a picture of him outside the embassy. That is very clearly, to the best of my knowledge, the same person. And one more. Former senior principal architect at Raytheon, Emerson Evia, is blocking food, water, and medicine from entering the embassy. In the fight for peace, whose side do you think he's on? And again, looking at the social media, it shows his profile, senior principal IT architect at Raytheon, and it shows a picture of a very, very, very similar looking man standing outside the Venezuelan embassy, posing with, again, entirely light-skinned Guaido supporters. It's important to note that one of the talking points they continue to use is that the people inside the embassy are not Venezuelan, but it's important to recognize that these people do not represent the vast majority of the Venezuelan people. A lot of black activists have pointed out, and a lot of just general other black and brown activists have pointed out that there are no Afro-Venezuelan or indigenous Venezuelan people present in these pro-Guaido mobs that have kept appearing, and that in fact they've been using very, again, racist language. They have used the term indio, which is literally translates to Indian, but you can imagine the kind of ethnic slur that connotates in Venezuela. They have called black people outside the embassy who are protecting the embassy, they have called them monkeys, and have continued to make jokes about that. They have used a homophobic slur. In Spanish, it's the M slur, but you'll recognize it as the F slur. It's a word that rhymes with maggot. They have essentially used that against the embassy protectors. They have threatened to rape and kill people. And then from my understanding, after all of this, after several weeks of this kind of behavior, they had the audacity to turn around one day when the kind of corporate media rolled into town for a day, and they happened to show up with an LGBTQ flag, with like a gay pride flag. That's the report I'm hearing. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's been very interesting to observe the class character of the opposition, as well as their political ideologies. I would say they actually are somewhat diverse in terms of their ideology. There's sort of a range. You have like out and out fascists who are just there to scream at people and steal food and be very creepy and violent towards people. And yeah, might work at a very, at the Raytheons and the IMFs of the world. Then you have like sort of liberal, perhaps, students who maybe don't have much of a political analysis to speak of, who are using these strange identity politics, or like sort of, I don't want to cuss, distorted identity politics, where they're saying, yeah, I'm Venezuelan, this is our embassy, I just want my embassy back, I just want to get my visa, I have the right to speak, stop silencing me. And it's like no one on the collective is claiming to be Venezuelan or to speak for Venezuelans. We clearly identify ourselves as U.S. citizens or people living in the U.S. who are standing against the U.S. actions. So it has been a mix of the kinds of arguments that you see them make, but I would say a lot of the leadership in terms of who's coordinating and who's calling for people to be there, the ambassadors, they are very much wealthy expats who left Venezuela likely because their interests of, generating wealth and having power and exploiting the millions of indigenous and Afro-Venezuelans and poor and working class people of Venezuela, once the rights of those people were being uplifted, and it wasn't just all exploitation all the time anymore. That's when a lot of them left the country, and now they're working at very nice jobs. Their children go to the Georgetown and the GW. I had one student pointing out to me who apparently is the son of one of the most wealthiest people in Venezuela, who was present at the marches and or at the demonstrations, and calling people misogynistic names and things like that. So I don't want to say every single, we did see this PR sort of shift slightly, where, some of the people they identify as gay on the opposition side, and so they had the pride flags. They're saying, "How can I be homophobic? I'm gay myself." And well, you're using slurs and you're threatening rape and violence against people, or you stand by and laugh and watch while someone else does it. So it did seem like they realized they were not coming across in the best way, and someone gave them some PR pointers, and they had the pride flags, and you would see a few of them try to tell each other, "Oh, stop, don't do that." But pretty quickly after a few days, it broke down. And just today I was recording, and this man is following me around and making fun of my nose of all things, saying I have a big ugly nose. Like, it's just so petty. You just why are you so cruel? Like, what kind of people are these that they just will follow you around and say nasty things, and you can't even attempt to have a dialogue or a discussion about the political situation and where people are coming from, because you can't even get past this point of that. And then there's many people, like I was saying, who simply have no political analysis, have no real understanding of what's going on, and simply say, "There's Americans in my embassy and I want them out." That's the beginning and end of their position.
That kind of brings me to the two last kind of questions I'd like to ask about the embassy itself. So if Carlos Vecchio were actually able to sit in the Venezuelan embassy, he would be sitting essentially by himself. The purpose of an embassy, to the best of my understanding, is to facilitate relations between two countries by bringing in a diplomatic mission from one country to the other country, where they can engage in all sorts of various diplomatic actions. They can also issue visas and whatnot. If Carlos Vecchio, who is the appointed ambassador of so-called ambassador of Juan Guaido, who does not control a single square inch of land and does not sit in any branch of government right now in office, if his so-called ambassador were to take over the embassy, there would be nothing for him to do. What could he possibly do other than sit there in his empty building? I guess he could issue fake visas on a fake letterhead if he really wanted to, but he would have no backing authority within the country to do anything at all. He would have no way to facilitate any sort of relations or any sort of communication between the governing PSUV and the Great Patriotic Pole that generally governs by coalition within the country. He would have no way of facilitating that communication with the U.S. government. He would be playing house all day. What would he be doing if he were to, again, illegally seize power within the embassy? And then, as kind of a follow-up to that, the other alternative is that there is a peaceful kind of resolution that can be seen. So if we were to if this peaceful resolution were to take place that the Embassy Protection Collective has put forth, and that the Venezuelan government appears to also want, which is kind of a protection of both embassies, because the Venezuelans have not tried anything like this with the abandoned American embassy in Venezuela, in Caracas. What would that look like? A sort of a successful, peaceful resolution to this? What does the Embassy Protection Collective and the government of Venezuela want?
Yeah, so as to what the ambassadors, these fake ambassadors, would do, I think one sort of clue is related to the OAS, Organization of American States, because they put in the trespassing notice that they released yesterday. it said embassy and OAS mission, and it specifically called out that the building should be used, a portion of the property is utilized by Venezuela as its permanent mission to the Organization of American States. So it seems that, which has, if I remember correctly, sort of the OAS, another kind of U.S. controlled entity, that body has recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president. So it seems that it will basically be a conversation between a bunch of people who are already talking. What we have been saying over and again on the ground is that the coup failed. The coup has failed in Venezuela. The most recent coup attempt of April 30th, May 1st failed miserably. The attempts before that have failed. And there's no question on the ground in Venezuela who is holding power. So they kind of doing this symbolic, it's a very symbolic victory that they would get if they were able to take over the embassy. Because yes, they could move their ambassadors in, but like you said, they don't have the full diplomatic powers that a diplomatic mission typically has. A common question is also, who is the foreign minister? The foreign minister of Venezuela is Jorge Ariaza. I don't know who Juan Guaido's foreign minister is. I don't even think that they have one. So there's no one directing what's supposed to happen at this embassy. All you have is a few people on the ground who would go into the building and sort of play government. So I think that they could have their meetings and they could do certain, they could call diplomatic meetings. They could go to the OAS, which they have, which is friendly to them, but it doesn't really say much for how they would do relationships with the rest of the world. The majority of the countries of the world do not recognize Juan Guaido as the president, and I think some of the countries who initially expressed support are, backing away from that original position. So it to us, it's a very symbolic victory for them, but it's very real for the Venezuelan government to maintain that embassy, if that makes sense. Like, it's a very real victory for us to hold on to it because it's, defending the sovereignty and self-determination of this country. But for them to take it over, okay, so you got an embassy and so what? You still don't have any control in Venezuela. And then this diplomatic, this sort of peace solution that we've been talking about and that we've been, letting people know about and communicating about as we continue our communications with the government of Venezuela and the diplomats who have originally requested that we be there, is the possibility of a protecting power agreement, or sometimes called as a protectorate. Basically what it means is you have a relationship between three countries, in this case the US, Venezuela, and a third country. A lot of times people say Switzerland. These three countries get together, establish an agreement where, rather than having the diplomats of the hosts, or, the host country isn't going to violate the embassy, the foreign government isn't going to be there. So this third party country is just going to manage the building and make sure that it stays safe. They also, I don't know all the details of protectorates. Possibly they are assisting with services, but they wouldn't be doing the full diplomatic responsibilities for sure. So that's the goal. That's what's normal. That's what's the normal way of doing diplomacy in times of conflict and crisis. I know there's several examples that can be found of different situations where protectorates have been established. That's the peaceful diplomatic role that we would want to see the U.S. go forward with. It at this point, we don't know the status of that. We don't know what, we're not privy to those conversations, but we're going to remain, the Embassy Protection Collective is dedicated, committed to remaining at the embassy until that happens, or until the U.S. Secret Service decides they're willing to violate international law and trespass into the embassy, seize the collective members, and hand it over to the Guaido puppet ambassadors.
And again, if that's what comes to pass, that's not just a blow for Venezuela in terms of its international, it's in terms of its recognition of sovereignty, or in terms of the recognition of Venezuelan sovereignty, but that then begins the process of international diplomatic breakdown. If America is willing to violate the sovereignty of the Venezuelan embassy, then there becomes no security for those embassies in the world, the American embassies in the world, to not have similar things happen to them if diplomatic relations were to break down anywhere. So again, there truly is so much at stake here in terms of just an international law and international precedent here, beyond whatever one might think of Maduro, of the Venezuelan government, whatever one might think of any of the kind of players involved in this. This has an implication that is much, much larger than Venezuela itself. Since we borrowed so much of your time, since we had you on the phone for so long, I'd like to give you a chance to just basically kind of talk about any sort of other work you've been doing, or other sort of other sort of upcoming kind of events that you feel like people should know about, or other kind of organizations who you'd like to just talk about for a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, I am a organizer with the Answer Coalition. That's Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. The Answer Coalition, you can check us out at answercoalition.org. I encourage people to sign up and get the email updates, both nationally, and there's chapters all over the country. And this is an organization that has been doing anti-war organizing since days after 9/11, when people anticipated that the U.S. would go to war in the Middle East, which ended up happening. So it's an organization that's been around for a long time, doing anti-war and anti-imperialist work. So even if you can't make it to D.C. to, come support the Embassy Protection Collective in person, we do welcome people to learn more about Answer Coalition and find out ways to get involved, see if there's anything's happening in their city. I'm also a local organizer here in Washington, D.C. with an organization called One DC. We do local grassroots organizing around our right to housing, income, and wellness. We do political education and tenant rights organizing and that kind of thing. So I just encourage people to check out the pages of the Embassy Protection Collective, Answer Coalition, the other groups, Popular Resistance, Code Pink. There's a number of other organizations that have supported, like Black Alliance for Peace, Veterans for Peace. So, you can see that this movement is not just peace activists, but ordinary people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and really can't emphasize enough. There are like activists and longtime organizers involved, but there's also students who just heard about it and came and stayed in the embassy overnight because they were moved to do so. So I really want to stress that it's just ordinary working class people who are doing this, and it's possible that the people listening, you could also do, some kind of work in your community to support this struggle. So even if it's just letting people know what's going on, sharing the information, holding a little community meeting at your home, we just encourage you to find ways to get involved with organizations that are doing this kind of work.
Yeah, there's always some way to get involved. And that's something that I always feel needs to be said, is it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what kind of work you do, what sort of time commitments you're able to make. There is a place for everybody in this sort of struggles. There are spaces for everybody in these sort of struggles. The Answer Coalition I consider it to be the kind of premier anti-war organization in the United States right now. Nobody else is doing the kind of impressive work that Answer Coalition has done. Full disclosure, I myself also have organized various protests around the Answer Coalition, and that's what kind of helps me stay involved, and that's what helps me kind of forge these connections between other anti-war organizers across the country. I think this has been a very kind of informative breakdown of this the struggles around this siege of the Venezuelan embassy, and the truly heroic actions of the Embassy Protection Collective and all of the associated organizations within that coalition. We've been watching every day out here in Austin. I know so many people who are watching every day across the country, and I want to thank you and everyone else who's on the ground there, either with the Embassy Protection Collective or just ordinary people who have just had enough of both the Trump administration's just violation of international law and generally the U.S. empire's blatant just blatant hypocrisy and blatant assaults on human rights. And to see this go down, it really is such a kind of heroic struggle. And every day, every minute that the Embassy Protection Collective keeps that embassy truly is, in my opinion, a victory. So we've been talking with Claire Cook, who's an organizer with the Answer Coalition in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Claire, for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And that was Claire Cook of the Answer Coalition talking about the situation on the ground just before the U.S. seizure of the Venezuelan embassy, which would be raided just a day or two after this conversation occurred. For our next episode, we will talk with Kevin Zeese of Popular Resistance, who is actually in the embassy, was arrested, and is still facing charges for his, again, legal tenancy on behalf of the Venezuelan government in the Venezuelan embassy at the point it was seized. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Empire Supernova. You have been listening to Empire Supernova. If you would like to hear more of our podcast, you can find us on patreon.com/Empire Supernova. You can also find further analysis from me, Brian Griffith, on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Empire Supernova originates out of Austin, Texas, and is now entering its second season, made possible by listeners like you. Please consider becoming a supporter today.